These are the words of Nehemiah, Hakaliah's son. In the month of Kislev, in the 20th year, while I was in the fortress city of Susa, Hanani, one of my brothers, came with some other men from Judah. I asked them about the Jews who had escaped and survived the captivity, and about Jerusalem. They told me, "Those in the province who survived the captivity are in great trouble and shame. The wall around Jerusalem is broken down, and its gates have been destroyed by fire." When I heard this news, I sat down and wept. I mourned for days, fasting and praying before the God of heaven. In the month of Nisan, in the 20th year of King Artaxerxes, the king was about to be served wine. I took the wine and gave it to the king. Since I had never seemed sad in his presence, the king asked me, "Why do you seem sad? Since you are not sick, you must have a broken heart." I was very afraid, and replied, "May the king live forever. Why should I not seem sad when the city, the place of my family's graves, is in ruins and its gates destroyed by fire?" The king asked, "What is it that you need?" I prayed to the God of heaven and replied, "If it pleases the king, and if your servant has found favor with you, please send me to Judah, to the city of my family's graves, so that I may rebuild it." Later, I said to the officials of Jerusalem, "You see the trouble that we are in. Jerusalem is in ruins, and its gates are destroyed by fire. Come, let's rebuild the wall of Jerusalem, so that we will not continue to be in disgrace." I told them that my God had taken care of me, and also told them what the king had said to me. "Let's start rebuilding," they said, and they eagerly began the work. But when Sanballat the Horonite, Tobiah the Ammonite official, and Geshem the Arab heard about it, they mocked and made fun of us. "What are you doing?" they asked. "Are you rebelling against the king?" "The God of heaven will give us success," I replied. "As God's servants, we will start building."
My friends, it is a privilege to bring the word to you today. Would you join me in prayer? May the words of my mouth and the meditation of our hearts be acceptable in your sight, Lord, for you are our strength and our salvation. Amen. Nehemiah is not a book that gets read very often in most church circles, and it's not a book on which I have preached many times. But in certain seasons of my ministry, it is a story that has really resonated with me. Many years ago, as part of the ordination candidacy process, I was required to develop a Bible study outline for a book of the Bible, and I chose Nehemiah. At the time, I was serving a congregation which was embroiled in conflict. A faithful group of saints from that church met with me every Saturday morning for 2 or 3 months. And we read through the book of Nehemiah together, and I field tested the Bible study outline that I'd written for my candidacy committee. Now, I'm no great Bible scholar, and I no longer have that old assignment stashed away in a file somewhere. But I remember how the story of Nehemiah resonated with those church women. Each week they reflected on the power of gossip, self-interest, and political maneuvering, and how it can decimate a congregation and derail it from its mission. They reflected through the story of Nehemiah on how powerful prayer, courage, and integrity of leadership can be in combating such forces of evil. They saw their own story in the biblical story. And doing so gave them confidence and a sense of agency as we worked together through a very challenging chapter of that congregation's life. I don't share this little tale because I think our churches are going down the tubes, nor do I believe that our congregations are plagued by much gossip, power struggles, or backroom intrigue. The national political scene, on the other hand, and the battle for climate justice is another story. And the message of Nehemiah, who was a political appointee, not a religious figure, although he was a devoted servant to God in that position, he reminds us of the importance of both faithfulness and wise and savvy use of power and community to achieve Herculean tasks. In case you've not already dipped into this Old Testament book, let me give you a little background. The year was 444 BC. The Babylonian exile had ended nearly 100 years earlier when King Cyrus of Persia conquered Babylon and permitted the Jews to return to Jerusalem, but not everyone had gone home. The exile lasted almost 70 years, long enough for most to forget what home was. And the Babylonians had treated the exiles quite well, giving them jobs and places in society. True, they were discouraged from speaking their old language and worshiping their old god, but many were quite comfortable in their new home and adopted many of the customs of their neighbors. A faithful core kept the faith alive. They recorded their people's history, and they are credited with the birth of the synagogue as a gathering place for prayer and the teaching of the law. These folks were anxious to return and rebuild the temple. They were eager to set back in place the old rituals and observances in hopes of not repeating the mistakes of history. But others stayed behind or traveled to places far beyond, in some cases spreading the Jewish faith far and wide, staying true to their heritage, but not feeling compelled to return to the homeland of their forefathers, except on pilgrimage. Nehemiah was one of these members of the Jewish diaspora, born long after others had returned to Jerusalem, and who served in a position of high trust. Our translation says he was a cupbearer in the winter palace of the Persian king Artaxerxes I. Albert just read for you the verses that will set the stage for this story. News from a visiting family member that all was not well in the old country, which leaves Nehemiah, a devout follower of God, mourning for his people. His time in prayer and fasting must have led him to the decision to make a tremendous petition of his boss. But he was one smart cookie. His time among the political elite had taught him a thing or two about how power works, and he knew what to ask for, not just permission and supplies to rebuild the walls of Jerusalem, but letters that credentialed him for the task. He was made the governor of Judea, a title which gave him authority but also made him some enemies. Nehemiah's chief antagonists were his counterpart in Samaria, north of Judea, a fellow named Sanballat, and an Ammonite official of the region east of Judea by the name of Tobiah. These guys, perhaps out of jealousy for the favor shown to Nehemiah, or perhaps simply because they wished to preserve the status quo and their sense of power in the region, invented the story that Nehemiah, by rebuilding the walls of Jerusalem, was planning to revolt against the very king who had given him the authority and material to do this. They use every sneaky trick in the book in a massive disinformation campaign. And if you've ever been embroiled in a church or organizational conflict, you might recognize the tactics. Talking behind his back, writing letters of complaint, planting spies, and people who would say things in public meetings like, "Oh, Tobiah's doing such a good work over in his corner," or "Sanballat is such a dependable guy, we all love him." In spite of the dirty politics, Nehemiah keeps his head and keeps his faith. But it gets pretty dicey. During the 52 days of marathon work on the wall, the insults and news of plotting get so hot and heavy that Nehemiah has to assign guards to protect the workers. In fact, the fourth chapter of the book describes the workers going at it with a tool in one hand and a weapon at the ready in the other, or working with a sword strapped onto their belts. It's a powerful and unsettling image. The last time I preached on Nehemiah was a couple weeks after the Tubbs fire of 2017. Rereading that sermon this week, I was struck by how many of its themes still ring true. Rebuilding and restoration of a community, whether coming back from a climate change-induced natural disaster or emerging from a global pandemic, is fraught with issues of self-interest and greed, glaring realities about inequity, and the ever-ongoing call to protect and care for the vulnerable, and the realization that social capital is priceless. We are not meant to go it alone in this life. We need each other to survive. And when we are isolated, we lose our resilience. Our Wednesday Zoom group is working through a book entitled A Field Guide to Climate Anxiety. The author, Sarah Jaquette Ray, is a professor of environmental studies at Humboldt State and directs this work especially at young people like her university students. But I am finding it really helpful in addressing my own mental well-being as we have been focusing for these weeks on climate justice. It is so easy to become overwhelmed, particularly when our mental capacities have been taxed to the breaking point by the multiple calamities and stressors of the past 18 months. This week's chapter addressed how negative self-talk is as powerful an underminer as the backbiting and gossip that Nehemiah faced. When we believe that we have no power or influence, when we believe that our efforts would be just a drop in the bucket and are therefore not worth undertaking, when we focus on a doomsday approach to spreading the news, inaction, depression, and despair are not long in coming. The labor for climate justice and building back from the events of the past 18 months, like the effort to rebuild the long-destroyed walls of Jerusalem in our Bible story, is as much a mental and spiritual battle as it is a scientific, infrastructure, policy, or logistical challenge. So we must keep all our tools at hand: prayer, gratitude, focus, a recognition of our unique giftedness and belovedness, compassion, listening, an open heart, willingness to learn, grow, sacrifice, and change. Prayer, again. This is a marathon, not a sprint. There are millions of hands and minds and hearts working on this. We are not alone, but we also are needed. Brothers and sisters, use your influence and your leverage. You have friends, you have family, you have neighbors, and strangers you come into contact with every day. Talk about these matters because most people are concerned, but they aren't talking or not talking enough. They are retreating into fear and inaction. To cultivate community, compassion, and courage, God is calling us to step up. Resilience is a proactive stance, and the stories this church carries are full of evidence that the people of God come together when times are difficult, and that God does great healing when they do so. We have social capital. Let's put it to good use for the sake of grace. Amen.